Okay, great. Well, now I would really be pleased to introduce Margaret Crawford, who is on the steering committee of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative. And last year she taught with Ann Walsh from Art Practice, a really interesting studio on Los Angeles. And she is going to be teaching a studio on Guangzhou this coming spring. And she's going to share a little bit about her approach to reading cities and tell you a little bit about this course as well.
Okay, thank you, Susan. All of these speakers sound really interesting. I'm definitely going to attend. Can we look? Okay, I have to apologize because my computer was stolen 2 days ago, and it took me, I had to go buy a new one and install all my stuff. So being from a visual discipline, I opted for slides rather than a text. So it may be a little bit disorganized because of that. Okay, let me see if I can make this work. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is a combination discussion of the topic of how to, what is it called, sense and read cities. Which is basically what I do as part of my job, and an ad for the research studio that I'll be teaching with Winnie Wong in the spring on the Pearl River Delta. Okay, here's Winnie Wong, there's me, and here's the Pearl River Delta. For those of you, few I'm sure, who may not be familiar with it, it is the triangle between Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Macau. The Pearl River Delta is, until recently, one of the most active manufacturing centers in the world, and I'm sure that every single one of you has on you something made in the Pearl River Delta right now. Your iPhone, which is made in Dongguan, in Shenzhen, partly at Foxconn. Pens, you name it, it's all made there. So it's a really intense manufacturing center, and very, I guess I would say, completely crazy place in terms of visiting it and trying to understand it. Now, both Winnie and I have been conducting research in the Pearl River Delta for a number of years, and I think we can say that it's a complex place. It's contradictory, it's confusing, it's even paradoxical. And so, in a way, the question that faced us when we put together this studio is, it's fascinating, but how can you communicate the incredible complexity, the confusing visual aspect of this place to a group of students in a relatively short space of one semester? So that's what we're trying to do. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the Pearl River Delta as a kind of introduction. Then I'll tell you about the ways in which we are going to approach it, the research methods that actually both of us surprisingly use. I should say, talking about us, Winnie Wong is in Rhetoric, but she is an interesting and unusual art historian who has done work on particularly the copy. And her book, Van Gogh on Demand, is about an art village, which I'll talk about in a minute, in Shenzhen, where they turn out, I guess, hundreds of thousands of copies of paintings and original paintings every year. So it's a very, very interesting book. I've been working from the perspective of built environment studies on villages and what villages actually mean in the urbanism of the greater Pearl River Delta for a number of years. So we're bringing slightly different, but actually surprisingly similar approaches to this topic. Okay, Pearl River Delta. Now, most discussions of Chinese urbanism focus on dense cities. I'm sure everyone's seen them. This is the CBD of Shenzhen, and actually this is in Xi'an, not in the Pearl River Delta, but most of the housing there is generic. A little hat may have some regional inflection, but little hats are out now, so mostly you'll see the flat roof, modern design. Typical Chinese urban development, incredibly rapid, fast track everything, very generic styles, a lot of copies, very dense, high-rise built environment, CBDs built overnight in places where there was nothing before, or villages. Most new housing built in these housing estates, which are basically gated communities, but all high-rise housing. So this is typical Chinese urbanism. Okay, we're not going to look at that. What we're going to look at is another phenomenon, which is the village. And here, I'm going to actually go ahead. In the Pearl River Delta, it is dense with villages. And this is a map of villages in Greater Guangzhou from post-1980. And the red are the villages. And you can see that these are villages. Oops. Oh, air bears. Go away. Okay. These are villages that have actually lost most of their agricultural land. So if you imagine them to be 2 or 3 times larger, you get a sense of what villages were like before 1989, which is basically in the Pearl River Delta, which was until recently one of the most productive, actually until since the 1950s, actually before the 1950s, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. The village was the basic unit of agriculture. So you can think of the village as the ground and the city is as the object. Villages are everywhere. I mean, you find them everywhere. They're all over the place. So villages are, in a way, the key to understanding and thinking about the Pearl River Delta. And actually, this is out of place. Oh dear, I lost it. But how do we think about that? There is a geographical term that we use to describe this known as, and actually it's got to be here, I'm sure we'll come across it later, which is called, now we can't remember the name, let me go back and see where this could be. Oh, desicoda. Desicoda is a term to use to describe this very mixed and, I guess you would say, mixed up and what looks to the observer to be a chaotic environment where elements of cities and elements of villages are mixed together. It's an Indonesian word. Desa means village and kota means town. And in many places in Asia, this is really a characteristic new type of landscape. Now, when we look at the Pearl River Delta, there are different kinds of villages because they've been affected by development, so the rapid development of industry and urbanization in the region. There are urban villages. Urban villages are really dense, and if you see here, Shipai Village was one of the densest. The legal limit for buildings is 3 stories, and you can see these go up 12 stories. Creating handshake, so-called handshake buildings where you can reach out and shake hands with your neighbor. Shipai Village, Xi'an Village, and you can see these are in the state of destruction because in Guangzhou in 2005, the city government mandated the destruction of all urban villages in the city. And so you can see here on the left-hand side is the village still standing. On the right-hand side is the demolition. And looking back, you can see what's replacing it, W Hotel. Here is another village. So urban villages are villages that existed as agricultural settlements until the city grew around them. And then they lost all their agricultural land. The city took it. And so they became landlords to all the migrant workers who come to Guangzhou to work in factories, and we'll see in a minute in other places. I've written an article about this, about the destruction of these urban villages. There's the reference to it. Peri-urban villages, these are villages in slightly less dense areas on the periphery of Guangzhou. This is one that we studied called Wangmei. And you can see they're less dense. Villagers they have corporations in which they, under Maoism, they were cooperatives, and now they become corporations, and then villagers have sold their land for development. And here's the so-called IT park that is on their former land, agricultural land. Long May, there's still some agriculture done not by village residents but migrants, and Long May is the center of the cheap gaming machine industry in China, and they sell gaming machines like slot machines and all kinds of things that are to low-end markets from mostly other developing countries. So one of the most interesting things about villages is every village is different. If you can say about Chinese urbanism, it's all the same. Every village is different. You can find two villages next to each other and they're completely different. So they're highly fascinating because of the different ways, directions that they've gone in. Here's some other, air bears is bothering me. I don't know how to get rid of it. No, how do we get it?
It's okay.
Okay. Another thing, and we'll talk about this in a minute, villagers are the only people in China who are allowed to build their own houses. And so they have developed, and this is in a peri-urban village, Shaoshu village, which we're studying. They have created their own housing types, some of which are very appealing. And these are single-family villager houses here. You can see very deluxe. They have also renovated the traditional village houses to make them more modern and have better plumbing, etc. They have created new typologies. These are the mixed-use loft, which has a shop on the bottom and then a law space for an artist on top. And this is a rental tenement. This is an apartment house with studio apartments for migrant workers. That is really interesting. Because the villagers rent their houses to migrants. Okay, then the third kind of village is the rural village. And one of the big issues in China, if you know, is food security. China wants to be self-sufficient agriculturally. In the Pearl River Delta, tragically, one of the most fertile regions in China, development has eaten up most of the agricultural land. But there is agricultural land. This is the southern part of Panyu, a district in Guangzhou, where there is agricultural land set apart that cannot be developed. And we studied a village there, Shawnee, and you can see that here's just the pictures of what an agricultural rural village is like. They really are trying not to develop them, but I think the pressure for development, if you look in the distance, you can see a crane, a construction crane. There are infrastructure projects and other projects that have priority. So development is actually a threat there. I guess one of the things I'll tell more about later is that villages in southern China, particularly in Guangdong province, are lineage villages. They have a very long history where everyone has the same name and they claim descent from a single ancestor. And one of the things you'll learn is how to read villages when you come in. And when we came to Shawnee, we realized immediately it was not a lineage village. It had no ancestor hall. It didn't have no feng shui, no ponds. And we discovered that it is a post-1949 village. In the Pearl River Delta, after 1949, the government brought boat dwellers on land, the Dan population. If any of you have seen the Bruce Lee movie, Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee goes in Aberdeen in Hong Kong, and he spends a lot of time that doesn't further the plot at all with the boat people. In China, they actually brought them ashore and gave them land, and so their villages are completely different. Anyway, so this is a non-lineage rural village. So that's the village. We'll learn more about the village in just a second. So that's one piece. The other piece is art and artist, and this combination seems really unlikely, but one of the things that we have discovered is there is a lot of art going on in villages and connections in villages with art, which the juxtaposition is the thing that creates the interest, the tension. the contradiction and even the paradoxes of this situation that are interesting. Winnie has studied and written this great book about Dauphin Village. Here it is. From above, we don't like aerial photographs, but that's all I could get at this time. Here it is on the street, producing container loads of paintings. Every furniture store, hotel is very likely to have a painting from Dauphin. If you go online, you can order paintings from Dauphin really cheaply. I have a photograph of my daughter needing to order a painting for $70, including frame. So it's a very, very well-known place. Who are the artists there? And one of the most interesting dimensions of Winnie's book is that people see Dauphin and they say, oh, factory, assembly line. But actually, it's not true. It's much more complicated than that. And there are multiple kinds of artists there doing many different genres of painting under many different economic conditions. Okay, yeah, the famous Mona Lisa, Japanese, you name it, you can get it. But again, it's much more complicated than that. Avant-garde artists have also worked in Dauphin. In fact, Ai Weiwei had some of his paintings painted there. This is Kristen Jankowski, a French artist, and one of the interesting things, he did a series of artworks about China painters, about the painters of Dauphin, in which he actually completely misunderstood the conditions of work. And this is another really interesting dimension. So what you find in these villages is an incredible range, from the most avant-garde to the most copyist kind of art. And that gives you a sense of the really different dimensions that art can take. Here's another village that we have studied in the University Island in Guangzhou. Many Chinese students go there to prepare for their exams to Chinese art academies, and they come from the busload and they will spend 6 months in the village going to these schools where they'll learn to do the very academic, you can say, style of art that you can use. I see people from China nodding that are necessary to know to get into a Chinese art academy. Another village, that Xiaoshu village, has been transformed into an art village outside of Guangzhou. And this is an interesting village because artists came here. They rented and transformed village houses into amazing galleries and lofts and studios. Then the government came in and decided that the culture industry prototype, they read Richard Florida's book and they said, we're going to do this. And then so the artists left and have moved elsewhere. But the galleries are still there. Here's some of the galleries under the freeway. They have galleries. Here's what the interiors of some of these spaces look like. Actually, among the most attractive housing I've ever seen in China. Really, really nice. Also in Guangzhou, avant-garde art. This is the Vitamin Creative Space, which is the main avant-garde. It's not just a gallery. They do a lot of projects with different artists like Sao Fei, did a lot of work with them, and other well-known artists. They're also working on villages. And a number of the artists there have done really, really interesting projects on villages. When I was there, not last summer, but the summer before, I went with one of the best-known artists in China as he filmed the village, and he's doing a project on soil. So you see the full range of art activities going on there. So now this is, again, out of space, but out of sync. So how do you understand all of this? You know, villages are complex. The art situation is complex. How do you start to understand it? From our humanities point of view, not the architectural point of view, because I have to say, almost every architecture school has sent studios to do village projects, and because they didn't really investigate the history or anything else, they got everything completely wrong. And they started doing projects that are really strange and silly. Scandinavians, I hope there are no Scandinavians here, because I'm going to say something snarky, are like really bleeding hearts. And so they see migrants and their heart goes out to them. So they take off time from school and go build dwellings for migrants in villages, which is really cute, but wasted effort because they don't really understand the situation. So we think it's really important to understand the history. The history of Guangzhou, the history of the Pearl River Delta is highly specific. Again, this is part of the Lingnan culture, which again is the southern China culture that began actually in the Ming Dynasty. They produced a very typical kind of village, and you can still see the outline in almost every village that we've looked at. We've looked at the Republican period, the kind of urban hierarchy that developed between the village, the market town, and the city. Again, if you've seen the Ip Man first movies, he's in Foshan in the Pearl River Delta. Actually, some really interesting information there. The Japanese occupation and obviously the Civil War. So there is a very long tradition of a type of village, again, with the lineages, established ancestor halls, sometimes multi-surname villages, sometimes single surname villages. Knowing that is going to make a huge amount of difference when you go to a place. It's fundamental. And so you find out that in spite of everything that has happened since, people are still understanding their village in terms of their lineages. And there's been a recent resurgence of interest in ancestor worship, ancestor halls, many of which have been revived. Okay, post-49, obviously everything changed. Land was completely redistributed.